Itamar Ben Gvir left Yale University last night to a shower of water bottles thrown by protesters. The Israeli National Security Minister spoke at the university, where a planned encampment by pro-Palestinian students was swiftly shut down by authorities. His visit has brought out growing tensions in the US, where Israel's war in Gaza has become a battleground in its own right, between those who see their protests as a question of constitutional and human rights on the one hand, and an increasingly authoritarian state on the other, that is claiming to fight anti-Semitism and disorder. For today's deep dive, we will explore this battleground and look at the fate of the protest movement that has brought freedom in America into question. Ben Gvir's departure from Yale University was reported in the Jerusalem Post with his own declaration of victory. He said, quote, "The anti-Semitic rioters will not intimidate me. I continue my important journey in the United States," a journey the Post described as his first official tour of the US. But just how important is this tour, and just how official? Ben Gvir has not had any formal meetings with US officials, including his counterpart Mike Waltz, but he was invited to dinner at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, a dinner in which he claims to have received official GOP support to bomb food and aid stocks in Gaza. Here's what he posted on X. "I had the honor and privilege of meeting with senior Republican Party officials at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. They expressed support for my very clear position on how to act in Gaza and that the food and aid depots should be bombed in order to create military and political pressure to bring our hostages home safely." While being welcomed by the government, Ben Gvir's visit has been viciously criticized by many in the US, including the Israeli-led group Unacceptable. Itamar Ben Gvir is not welcome in our community, so they declare in a rallying call for protesters to gather in New York's Upper East Side later today.
So right now I'm standing here in Battery Park at the south end of New York City's financial district. The reason I'm standing here is because just an hour from now, Israeli Minister for National Security Itamar Ben Gvir is scheduled to come and speak to a delegation of Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans here in the financial district. You showed that clip of his talk last night at Yale University that was disrupted by protesters. That same group, Yale's Shabbatai Society, who hosted him yesterday, is hosting him again today. And it is obviously controversial. He's only been here for a couple of days. He arrived on Monday, and yet every single place he's been faced with protesters. And interestingly, they haven't just been pro-Palestinian protesters like the ones that we saw at Yale yesterday. Today, he's being picketed outside his talk by pro-Israeli and pro-democracy protesters who say that they're outraged by the fact that somebody like him is even given a platform here in the US and that he shouldn't be allowed in the country at all.
What do you mean when you say somebody like him? You know, Ben Gvir was once something of a pariah in the US. Now he's having dinner at Mar-a-Lago. But as you point out, it's not without a backlash. Can you just tell us a bit about his background and why his visit is seen as so controversial?
So you mentioned this group Unacceptable. They describe themselves as a pro-Israeli, pro-democracy movement that has been advocating in the last 18 months for the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza. They released a statement, a petition against Ben Gvir's visit that was signed by 1,200 members of the Jewish American and Israeli American communities. That included rabbis, that included families of the hostages, as well as US lawmakers. And they said in that statement that Ben Gvir's dark vision of Judaism, of Israel, and of the Middle East is not welcomed and is rejected. The organizer of the protest today and the founder of the Unacceptable group, Ofer Gutelzon, said that despite there being quite a lot of division within the US American Jewish communities, there is unanimity among these groups of the rejection of Ben Gvir. Now, if you take a look at Ben Gvir's colorful history, you can kind of see why. This is somebody that ever since he was a teenager, was a visible presence on the far fringes of Israel's right-wing extremist Zionist movement. He is somebody that prescribes to Meir Kahan, a rabbi who in the 80s and 90s advocated for for such extreme policies of expelling Palestinians by force if necessary, annexing all territories, including the West Bank and Gaza, that he has been banned in most of Israeli civil society. Ben Gvir himself, when he was a teenager, was so extreme that the Israeli army barred him from mandatory military service, something every Israeli has to do by the time they finish high school. In 2007, he was charged with 8 counts that included a terrorism charge and a charge of inciting racism. And yet, despite all of this, his popularity has grown in recent years among the far right and among the religious Zionist movement. In 2022, he enters the government alongside Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, in this partnership that allows Netanyahu to remain empowered. And in exchange, Ben Gvir goes from this far-right extremist to the Minister for National Security, effectively giving him de facto control over the police. And immediately, as soon as he gets into office, he starts enacting his vision across the West Bank and in Jerusalem. He starts handing out guns at Israelis, promoting the attacks on on Palestinian villages and towns by Israeli settlers, and has been, over the last 2 years in particular, one of the most vocal proponents of the war in Gaza. In January of this year, when Prime Minister Netanyahu signed that very short-lived ceasefire agreement with Hamas, Ben Gvir took his party out of government, threatening to collapse the entire government if the war didn't continue. And now he is calling on that war to continue, to the extent that essentially, and he's said this a number of times, that he advocates for the complete expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the complete annexation of it by the Israeli government.
Now, Ben Gvir has presented this visit to the US as an official state visit. The US is not acknowledging it as being quite so official. So help us out. Which is it? How important is this trip, actually?
So it is a little bit confusing as to exactly why Ben Gvir is here and why he's here this week. Even Israeli media reports seem to be confused as to whether this is an official state visit or it's not. He was slated to meet with high senior officials in the government, including his national security counterpart, Mike Waltz. That didn't happen. He was meant to appear in Brooklyn and meet with some of the Orthodox Jewish communities here. That was canceled because of a backlash. And so it appears that the number of events that he has been hosted have been little more than op-eds, opportunities for him to show his community back home that he is an important figure of the government that's being treated as any other Israeli delegate would. But the important thing to note is that just 3 years ago, he was on a list of people that the Biden administration was considering banning completely from ever entering the United States. He hasn't been here since 2013, and he's always feared that he might not be allowed to step in. And so the fact that he is here at all has outraged those that are vocal opponents of him, which have included, of course, pro-Palestinian activists, as well as Israeli Americans and Jewish Americans.
Ben Gvir's trip most recently included a visit to Yale, a university that firmly shut down planned encampments by student activists who were protesting his visit. We were expecting to actually be reporting on these encampments today, but most of the ones that were planned are no longer going ahead. Why not?
Yeah, so this week is particularly significant because it marks a year on since the beginning of these university encampments that gripped the United States and then the world. And they started from Stanford and from Columbia University here in New York. And activists that I've spoken to, students that I've spoken to, say that for weeks they have been planning a return to these encampments, to erect those tents again and to march again and to call on their administrations firstly, to divest from companies that they see are complicit with the war in Gaza, and secondly, to stop what they say is a capitulation to pressure from the Trump administration. But despite all of this, we saw a very short-lived encampment take place at Yale to coincide with Ben Gvir's visit. About 2 hours later, those students that had put up about 8 tents were threatened by the administration to tear down the tents themselves or face either trespass or repercussions to their own careers, their own study at these universities. And as a result, this message has also filtered into some of the other groups. And then just yesterday, just 24 hours before a similar encampment was supposed to be set up at Columbia University today, that story leaks into the media. It features on NBC News. all of a sudden security gets tightened, and a lot of the students are become afraid that something will happen. They will be stopped, or worse, that police will be allowed to enter onto the campus once again to arrest some of them, as they have done in the past. And so as a result, we are now waiting to see which encampments do get built again today. We know of at least one New York campus that it will attempt to bring that encampment up. Others might follow, but as a result of everything that's happened over the last couple of days, including, I should mention, FBI raids that took place targeting pro-Palestinian students in Michigan and in and around the University of Michigan campus. Some of those people have had their devices taken off them and scanned. It really sent a shock through the Michigan student population, and that reverberates outward. So we're waiting to see what happens, but for the time being, it seems that students have put their plans on hold.
You describe these much more heavy-handed shutdowns by universities of protests happening on campus. You also talked about these FBI raids that are deterring students from participating potentially in protests that they would otherwise have partaken in. Now, this is being reported, at least in Israeli media, as proof that Trump's so-called anti-Semitism crackdown is working, or at least that this marks the end to the student protest that has been going on for a year now. From where you're standing, does that seem accurate? Does this feel like, the protests are coming to a close?
It's hard to describe how much of a shockwave these encampments caused in the political scene here in the US last year. They led to Senate hearing after Senate hearing. Ultimately, 5 of the most powerful university administrators, presidents of Ivy League institutions, had to leave their jobs as a result of what a lot of US politicians were accusing them of creating an environment, allowing an environment of anti-Semitism to foster, that made so-called Jewish students on campus afraid. That has been refuted, of course, by the encampments themselves and by a number of Jewish students at a lot of these campuses that we've spoken to that have taken part themselves in the encampments. And so this was the context for when Donald Trump enters office. One of the things he campaigns on is he's going to start arresting, detaining, and deporting any international students that take place or took part in these encampments. In the last months of last year, a number of students here at Columbia were either questioned by the police, had their scholarships revoked. Some of them weren't allowed to even graduate, even just months before they were supposed to finish their qualifications. This time round, we have seen a wave of arrests, and people will, of course, be aware of the arrest of a high-profile arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University graduate, just outside of his home in early March. That was followed by a number of high-profile arrests, including another Columbia student, Mahmoud Mohsen Mahdawi. Both of them were green card holders. An international student from Turkey, Romeysa Öztürk, was arrested by ICE officials, immigration officials, in mosques while she was walking in public. All of that has created this environment of fear intentionally to stop these pro-Palestinian students from returning to campus, from returning to their encampments, and from participating in pro-Palestine activism. It is being slated under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, and yet many of the critics of the Trump administration say that this is just an excuse to allow the White House to sink their teeth into these university administrations and try to get them to change policies, to try and change the way that they run their faculties, and ultimately change the culture of leftism and liberalism that many in the MAGA movement have long accused these universities of harboring.
One institution is, of course, pushing back, and that is Harvard. The university has sued the government over funding cuts that it sees as illegal state interference into educational freedom. What's the latest with the Harvard case?
Well, a number of universities have had these icky conversations with the Trump administration, and the Trump administration has had made no attempts to soften their interrogation of these faculties. They have already threatened a number of Ivy League institutions and several other universities of cutting vital federal aid funding, federal grants that these universities rely on. And that included about $400 million of an endowment to Columbia University that ultimately forced them to agree to review their Middle Eastern Studies program, which has caused outrage across the faculty, across a lot of the student body. And the latest of that was this letter of demands that was sent to Harvard's administration 2 weeks ago. That came as a shock to Harvard, and it came as a shock to a lot of people, because what it essentially asks of Harvard is to coordinate with US law enforcement, to coordinate with the Trump administration, hand them lists of international students that take part in these protests, as well as audit their own curriculum under the supervision of the Trump administration. So Harvard, which is the wealthiest university in the world, it has about $50 billion of endowment every year, is seen by many as one of, if not the only universities that has the financial weight and power to be able to push back. And that's exactly what they're doing right now. They're taking the Trump administration to court so that they can back down and stop threatening them with a funding cut.
Now, these troubles are not just unfolding on US campuses. The crackdown on pro-Palestine activists fits into a wider expansion of state control that we have witnessed under the second Trump presidency. And that includes new powers of detention, mass deportations without trial, government rejections of direct court orders. While out there, Mohammed, what sense have you gotten of how these policies are affecting people living in the US emotionally and in terms of their day-to-day lives?
You know, Matilda, I was last here in New York and in the United States in November, just after the election, the re-election of Donald Trump. And the mood here at that time felt really indifferent. People felt as if, well, you know, Trump is back in office. It wasn't that bad last time. It's not going to be that bad this time. And we are less than 100 days into this Trump administration. And the atmosphere here is chilling. People are incredibly uncertain. They're uncertain for many things, because of the economy, because of Trump's tariff policies. They're uncertain because of the crackdown on illegal immigration, on people that are legal migrants to this country that have yet still either been detained into ICE detention, such as the 3 pro-Palestinian students that I mentioned that are now in a facility in Louisiana, and also the wide crackdown on Latin American migrants. 200 of them have been sent to a prison camp in El Salvador, and including, you know, the very high-profile Kilmar Obrego Garcia, who was, despite a court order allowing him to stay in the U.S., despite a court order saying that the United States government has to facilitate his return, the U.S. has refused. And so all of these things on top of each other have created this climate where so many people that I'm talking to now are feeling a real sense of fear, a real sense of anxiety. A number of people have told me these are US-born citizens that are walking around with their passports in their pockets because they are afraid that they're going to turn a corner and an ICE van is going to pull up. People in masks are going to get out of it and they're going to be disappeared. People are really scared that something might happen. And whether or not that is the reality, that is certainly the fear here in the US.